It was not a fleet engagement that broke the peace of the galaxy. It was a nursery car, 98 light seconds out from a station no human weapons had ever threatened, vaporized so cleanly that the only debris the rescue drones recovered was a single, scorched nameplate from a child's crib. The vessel had been called the Heraclitus Breeze, a civilian liner carrying 4,612 passengers, most of them families of terraformers bound for a new world called Eden. Nearly 1,800 of those passengers were under the age of 12. The Conclave of 12 received the distress pulse almost in real time, replayed it 5 times for clarity, and within an hour told every ambassadorial office in known space that the strike had been an accident, that the weapons had been miscalibrated, that the responsible officers had been quietly reassigned, and that the matter would not require a session. The Conclave called it a navigational error. They called it, in the private channel that Terran diplomatic staff would later intercept, a message. The galaxy had been making that message louder for a very long time. For 63 years, the Dominion of Viraxi had treated the human territories as a curiosity, a fringe civilization whose colonies clung to a handful of dull yellow stars and whose trade volume was acceptable but unremarkable. The older species said humans were useful. They said the humans were brave in the way rabbits are brave, plentiful in the way rabbits are plentiful, and ultimately incapable of doing anything that would require the Dominion to update its strategic planning. Conclave records from that era are still public. They describe humanity as a stabilizing nuisance, a minor species whose principal export was noise. There is a footnote, 2 pages in, that reads, with the calm of accountants writing off inventory, species of this profile does not survive first contact with a serious peer. Then the Heraclitus Breeze vanished, and the footnote became policy. The Viraxi commander on station issued an apology longer than the ship's own passenger manifest, then a smaller apology, then no apology at all. Then eventually a short lecture about the natural risks of frontier travel. They expected grief. They expected protest. They expected a human delegation to arrive at the conclave chamber with wet eyes and trembling voices, and they had already prepared seating for the cameras. What arrived instead, 3 standard days after the strike, was a single human delegation of 7, all wearing the dark gray of the Terran Foreign Office, carrying nothing but a sealed dossier and a recording of the killing pulse. They entered the chamber, requested the formal reading of the Conclave's own Article 19 regarding the deliberate destruction of civilian craft under protected passage, and waited. The Conclave refused. The presiding speaker of that session, a Viraxi elder whose name meant something close to memory of stone, informed the human delegation that Article 19 had never been invoked against a senior signatory in living memory, and would not be invoked now, because doing so would damage the credibility of the institution. He said this without raising his voice. He said it with the air of a judge explaining arithmetic to a child. The human delegation did not argue. They did not raise their voices, did not slam the table, did not weep, did not storm out. They opened the dossier, laid its contents before the chamber, and walked out. Inside the dossier were the names, in alphabetical order, of every passenger aboard the Heraclitus Breeze, with their ages, their medical records, their last transmitted messages to friends and family, and the precise second at which each one of them was estimated to have ceased to exist. The dossier had been compiled, the head of the delegation noted quietly, by children working through the night on a school volunteer relay in a colony called Reykjavik North. The chamber sat in silence. The conclave moved on to the next agenda item, which concerned trade quotas for atmospheric nitrogen. What the conclave did not know, and what the Viraxi certainly did not understand, was that no one walking out of that chamber had needed to volunteer for anything. The compilation of that dossier, the tracking of those final messages, the careful preservation of every encrypted sentence from every terrified parent aboard a dying ship was not an improvised act of grief. It was doctrine. The Terran Foreign Office ran it under a name that does not appear in any public treaty, and it had been rehearsed in war games across 4 separate human governments for at least 11 years before the Heraclitus breeze ever left dry dock. Thier's Protocol, they called it in the inner offices. The doctrine begins with a single sentence that every human officer above a certain rank is required to recite from memory at least once per standard year. We do not forget, we do not forgive, and we do not stop. The Conclave's response to the dossier was to schedule a tribunal in a city called Halen Vor on neutral ground. They gave the humans 72 hours' notice. They seated the gallery with interested parties from 7 different empires. They allowed the humans a single advocate and an hour to present. The tribunal's stated purpose was to assess whether the Heraclitus breeze strike constituted a war crime under galactic law. The unstated purpose, every human analyst understood within the first 6 minutes of the proceedings, was to produce a legal record that would later be used to argue humans had been given their day in court. They were going to absorb the loss. They were going to authorize it. They were going to stamp it with the dignity of procedure and then dare humanity to complain. What the tribunal produced, 11 hours into that single allotted hour, was a defense. The Dominion's representative argued that the Heraclitus breeze had been operating without the correct transponder pulse, that it had failed to respond to 37 hails, that its flight path had intersected a freshly declared weapons test corridor with no public announcement but ample marine notice, and that under those circumstances the destruction of the vessel was lawful. He argued this with charm. He argued this slowly. He used the word regrettable 6 times and the word necessary 9. He never raised his voice. He never named a single child. When the human advocate asked, as his final question, whether the Dominion would have fired on a Tailvos nursery car under identical conditions, the Dominion's representative smiled, as one smiles at a small, clever animal, and said that the analogy was unsuitable for discussion. The tribunal retired. It returned 4 hours later with a unanimous ruling that the strike was lawful under the defense of navigational hazard, that no compensation was owed, that no apology was owed, and that the human delegation was reminded in writing that further disruption of conclave proceedings could result in the suspension of humanity's observer status. The ruling was 82 pages long. It cited precedent from 4 separate civilizations, none of them human. Its final paragraph thanked the tribunal's clerical staff for their long service. The human delegation accepted the verdict, packed their things, and left Halen Vor on a civilian charter that was, by then, being tracked by every listening post in 3 sectors. On the way home, in a sealed cabin on that charter, the head of the Terran delegation opened a separate channel to the Admiralty of the Outer Reach and spoke 8 words. Thier's Protocol is now in effect. 7 minutes later, the channel was closed, and the words were never repeated. Within 4 hours, 73 separate human commands across 9 star systems began executing variations of a plan they had each rehearsed, but never expected to run. Some of those commands had been waiting since before most of the children aboard the Heraclitus breeze had been born. The Dominion's listening posts, because human ships are not quiet, picked up the usual chatter of supply chains and convoy traffic. They filed the chatter under routine. They did not recognize the cadence signals hidden in the commercial bands, the small shifts in code, the way certain freighters changed their advertised speed within fractions of a kilometer per second. They had no way to. The signals had been designed decades earlier by a racial memory of having been ignored. The first sign that the gallery had misread the situation came a week later, in a system called Orestes. A Viraxi customs cutter, performing a routine inspection of a human grain convoy, lost contact with its own command. Within 90 seconds, every ship in the convoy had its weapons locked, its civilian crew off the bridge, and its orders authenticated by a name that the cutter's computers had never seen before. The convoy did not fire. It transmitted, on every band the cutter had been listening on, a single paragraph in legal viraxy. The paragraph cited Article 19 of the Conclave's own charter, the very article the tribunal had refused to invoke, and it stated, in the dry language of interspecies law, that the human convoy considered itself the lawful arresting authority for any vessel operating in support of, or in denial of accountability for, the destruction of the Heraclitus breeze. The cutter, alone and reading this paragraph for the first time in its career, was politely boarded by 4 human marines armed with weapons it had never seen catalogued. They took the cutter's crew home. They took the cutter itself. They left no casualties. They left, taped to the inside of the cutter's command chair, a copy of the children's dossier. The Conclave called it piracy. The Dominion called it an act of war. The Tailvos delegation, who had stayed silent through the tribunal, called it something else entirely, in a private back channel that the Terran Foreign Office had been monitoring for 9 years. They called it the doctrine they had warned their own children never to invoke. The Tailvos had a name for it. They had learned it the hard way, 2 generations earlier, the last time they had attempted to absorb a frontier invasion by pretending it was a navigational hazard. The humans, they said in that channel, are now under grief. The Dominion, having chosen to read grief as weakness, escalated. They dispatched a battle group, a beautiful formation of 9 warships in ceremonial order, to enforce a no-fly zone around one of the disputed trade lanes. The formation was led by a flagship whose captain had personally overseen the firing solution on the Heraclitus breeze, and who had been quietly decorated for the act. The formation arrived in theater expecting another tribunal. What it found, drifting in the dark of the trade lane between 2 strobing buoys, were the wreckage of 2 human cargo ships. They were not destroyed. They were uncrewed. They had been set adrift with their engines running, their lights on, and their holds full of grain, and they had been anchored in the precise path the Dominion formation would have to take to enforce its no-fly declaration. The Dominion commander ordered the formation to hold. He ordered a survey. He ordered an investigation. The investigation, completed within the hour by a probe that no one had seen launched, returned the following finding. The cargo ships were bait. What followed was the first moment in modern galactic history in which a human fleet did something openly obscene and got away with it. There was no battle, because battles are loud, and the humans were not loud. There was, instead, an extinction event disguised as one. The Terran Third Fleet entered the trade lane from a vector that the Dominion's tactical models classified as impossible for any ship larger than a scout, and it did so without firing a single weapon. It deployed, in sequence, a series of sensor buoys that had been developed in secret across 31 years of human engineering. Each buoy, once activated, mapped the entire interior volume of every Viraxi warship within 400,000 kilometers, down to the individual officer eating breakfast in the flagship's wardroom. The buoys did not destroy. They did not jam. They simply watched, with the patient, merciless clarity of grief that has been catalogued by children, and they recorded everything. The Dominion fleet, suddenly visible in a way no warship had ever been visible, suddenly knowable in a way no enemy had ever been knowable, suddenly turned around and went home. The conclave's presiding speaker called an emergency session 11 days later, and for the first time in his long political career, he spoke with the voice of a man who has realized he is about to be remembered badly. He read out, in full, the names of the 1,800 children aboard the Heraclitus breeze. He read them for 4 hours. He did not speed up. He did not skip. When he reached the end, he announced that the conclave, with regret, had opened a formal review of the original tribunal's ruling, that the Dominion had agreed to a binding compensation package for the families of the dead, that the responsible admiral had been placed under conclave detention, and that the human observer status would be elevated with immediate effect to full membership with voting rights. He said all of this without terms. He said it without conditions. He said it without the usual procedural scaffolding of empire protecting itself from its own consequences. He said it because he had by then no other sentence available. What the human delegation accepted in return was modest by the standards of grief and absolute by the standards of law. They asked for the formal reclassification of the Heraclitus Breeze strike as a war crime. They asked for the permanent expulsion of the Dominion officer responsible from the conclave's protected service. They asked for the right to read, once per standard year, in this chamber, in front of every ambassador and every camera, the names of the 1,800 children. The conclave agreed. The conclave agreed because, by then, every listening post in the galaxy had quietly received, through channels they did not know they had, a single encrypted file. The file contained a compromat so thorough, so calmly obscene, so complete in its documentation of the Dominion's secret complicity in the strike, that its publication would have ended the Dominion as a political institution within a single generation. The conclave knew this. The conclave agreed to everything. The conclave did not even ask for the file's destruction. They understood by then that no human institution would ever destroy such a file. That was the doctrine. That was always the doctrine. The galaxy learned, in the long quiet of the months that followed, what humanity had actually been doing while the conclave was busy not listening. The humans had not waited for permission to remember. They had not waited for the conclave to authorize their grief. They had not waited for a tribunal to recognize what had been done to their children. They had built, across 63 years of being called a nuisance, an entire doctrine of remembrance. They had built archives in every colony that recorded every name, every age, every last message of every person lost to every act of galactic indifference. They had built fleets trained not to win wars in the traditional sense, but to make sure that no one who harmed a human family would ever again be permitted to hide behind procedure. They had built a foreign service whose central competency was not diplomacy. It was patience. It was the slow, methodical, compassionate patience of a species that has decided once and for all that its children are not acceptable losses. The Dominion withdrew from the trade lane. The Dominion withdrew from 2 more. Within a single standard year, the human territory stood at the largest territorial extent they had ever enjoyed in galactic law. Not because they had conquered anything, but because the galaxy had finally stopped pretending not to know what it owed. The Tailvos, whose ambassador had once called humanity under grief, now introduced a new phrase into conclave vocabulary, a phrase that translators handle carefully because it does not have a perfect equivalent in any language. It means, roughly, the moment a civilization mistaken for small reveals that its memory is larger than your empire. The conclave began using the phrase in their own briefings. They used it without irony. They used it because they understood, at last, that the humans had never been small. The humans had been waiting. And if the galaxy forgets again, as empires sometimes do, the children's dossier is still being updated. New names are added to it every year, attached to living volunteers who take shifts at the relay stations in Reykjavik North and elsewhere, transcribing by hand the final words of every human being the galaxy has ever decided was acceptable to lose. They do it because someone has to. They do it because the doctrine requires it. They do it because a species that remembers its dead is a species that, eventually, makes itself impossible to ignore. That is what humanity is. That is what humanity has always been. The galaxy can call it whatever it likes. The galaxy has, finally, run out of words to call it anything other than true.